simultáneo, entonces.
Estamos grabando.
Gracias.
Acaban de entrar todos.
Buenas tardes. Les damos cordialmente la bienvenida a esta sesión de las conferencias en Filosofía, Política y Teoría Crítica del Derecho. El día de hoy tenemos una sesión que en adelante vamos a continuar en idioma inglés, en la que vamos a tener la oportunidad de oír una conferencia y compartir algunas inquietudes sobre ella por parte del profesor Schuett. En este momento voy a cederle el uso de la palabra al señor Alexander Springer de la Embajada de Austria, que nos acompaña el día de hoy y va a hacer la presentación del panel y pues nos va quizás pues, dar unas anotaciones generales sobre el tema de nuestra discusión el día de hoy. De este momento en adelante pasamos entonces a lengua inglesa. Más adelante, cuando hagamos nuestra sesión de preguntas y respuestas, en caso de que alguno de los participantes quiera hacer una pregunta en español, podremos hacer la traducción simultánea, pero más allá de eso, continuaremos en lengua inglesa. Dr. Springer, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jorge. First of all, it is again my great pleasure to come back to Universidad Externado de Colombia. We have had a very fruitful cooperation with this university already for some time now, circling loosely around the topic of Hans Kelsen. So I'm very happy to be back. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Jorge Restrepo, Director del Centro de Estudios Constitucionales, Carlos Restrepo Piedrahita. Thanks also to Diego Moreno, the Director of the Institute for the Study of Law and Philosophy, for making this possible. For me, it's a great pleasure to introduce today a very distinguished Kelsenian scholar, directly related to this great Austrian, not only philosopher of law or theoretician of law, but also really a practitioner of statecraft and of diplomacy in the wider sense. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you, Robert, to welcome you to Colombia. His first time in Bogota, in Colombia, and so a really great pleasure to welcome him here today. The reason we have him is that we have recently translated his latest book, The Political Realism of Hans Kelsen, into Spanish, El Realismo Político de Hans Kelsen, which appeared with the University Press of Universidad Nacional de Colombia. And we're very happy to be able to produce this book to help its publication and its also its diffusion through this media. So without further ado, let me introduce the two panelists of today. First of all, Jorge Antonio García, who will be joining us online. Hello, José. It's really a great pleasure also to have you back here discussing about Kelsen. It's wonderful to have you. He's a full professor at the University of Valencia in Spain, at the Department of Philosophy of Law and Politics. He's also a member of the Institute of Human Rights at the same university, and he has published widely on international relations and law. Among his books is a book about Kelsen versus Morgenthau, which was published in 2016, if I'm not wrong. And more recently, he has published a small volume on Hans Morgenthau, who will also be featured very prominently in Robert's talk about peace through diplomacy. He has also translated and edited a volume of Kelsen's a little bit lesser known works in international law. I have a copy of that book here, International Law and Justice, which are several articles which Kelsen wrote in the 1940s about international law, especially transitional justice and international criminal law. with regard to the criminal trials of Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg. So again, thanks for joining us today, Jose. Our other panelist today is Robert Schuett. Robert is a former Austrian civil servant who has recently gone private. You founded a strategic advocacy and consultancy in Vienna, SDK Powerhouse, where you are the co-director. But you have also been an academic. You have published a number of works. You started your education in the UK, did a PhD at the University of Durham. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I had it on the back of my head, but I didn't write it down. You see, that's why you should always write down critical facts. University of Durham, which was also on Kelsen, but on from another point of view, also as a realist, but in connection with Freud. So also a very interesting topic you will also be dealing with in your talk. Then you went on to do a postdoc at the University of California in San Diego, and you've been a professor at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna, where you still teach at the University of Salzburg, and also a senior fellow at the University of Durham. And you will now, which I think will be a very interesting experience, very soon go to the US to be the Fulbright Potsdamer Fellow of Austro-American Studies at the University of Stanford. So thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us in this interesting discussion. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, hi. Buenas tardes. I guess that's the saying. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It means a lot to me to be here, I must say, and I really mean it, not only because the book has been translated into Spanish, my book on Colombian soil. It's my first visit to Latin America. Alexander, as you know very well, to Bogota too. I love that place. I've been here for 5 days. I really do. I enjoy it, and I hope this is the first of many visits and of many exchanges that we have over Kelsen and other things. So again, thank you very much for that warm welcome. Alexander, if you mentioned I'm an Hans Kelsen scholar. Honestly, I do not know. I do not know. We will find out. I published a lot on Hans Kelsen, but I may not be the kind of typical Hans Kelsen scholar, if there is such a thing as a typical Hans Kelsen scholar. Because what I do, I approach Hans Kelsen and his thinking from a fairly particular angle, I must say. And what I hope you can see behind me is a picture that may symbolize where I come from intellectually and practically. That's the Hans Kelsen room in the Hofburg, which is the presidential palace in Vienna. There's such a room in the lovely Hofburg. I took this picture 10 years ago when I was working, when I had the pleasure of doing my civil service training in the president's office. And I spent a lot of time in that room to reflect on democracy, foreign affairs, the global scene, if you wish. And what I'm really saying is I have approached, when writing the book, Hans Kelsen's Political Realism, from two perspectives. One is me being a political theorist, an international relations theorist, and the other one is, as you have mentioned, Alexander, as a practitioner, as a security practitioner, as a civil servant. And I think the book shows it does. What I want to do today is not going through all the chapters of the book. It would be perhaps quite boring, but I would like to focus on one chapter in particular, and that chapter is called Kelsen's Foreign Policy Realism, or as I title it today, Hans Kelsen on War and Peace. If we continue with the slides, please. To the context, briefly. I'm not a jurist. You said it. I'm a civil servant. I come from the world of security and statecraft. And actually, and I said it as a funny anecdote. When I wrote the book and it was finished, I tried to publish it, of course. I had published 3 books before that one, but finding a publisher for that book in particular was not so easy. Because what I did immediately, of course, as a political theorist, I approached politics editors of various university presses in the UK and in the United States. And the typical reaction I got was, okay, political realism, good, but Hans Kelsen, who is he? We've never heard of Hans Kelsen, which was shocking to me in many ways. And then I explained who Hans Kelsen was, and I said, look, Hans Kelsen, this is one of the greatest legal minds of the 20th century, the legal superstar. He co-drafted the Austrian constitution. He's from today's standards, again, a legal superstar, a fascinating figure. He's a democracy theorist as well, constitutional lawyer, international lawyer. And then, of course, I said, look, well, if that's the case, speak to the law folks in the presses. Go to the law editor and pitch your book there, which I did. I talked to the law people at these presses. And I explained, okay, Hans Kelsen, okay, we're fine with Hans Kelsen, but what do you mean by political realism? And then I said, yeah, I tried to make the case in the book that Hans Kelsen is a political realist. Meaning, you write a political book about Hans Kelsen, not a legal text. No, it's a political book. And we can take it. Talk to the politics editor. Okay, go back to that. So I've just been to the politics editor, okay, but he referred me to you. And it was a back and forth. And eventually my kind of home publisher, Edinburgh University Press, I nudged him and said, look, just publish the book, please. Okay, find 2 or 3 referees, peer reviewed, and just get it done, and I'm happy with it. More seriously, the book's context is relatively clear. I wrote the book in the winter of 2018, 2019. So that was after the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And by that time, I was actually in the Austrian Ministry of Defense. I was leading a task force that was dedicated to the theme of hybrid warfare, hybrid threats. And by day, so to say, Alexander knows very well, I was doing my job as a civil servant. But by night, I turned into a Kelsen scholar, apparently. And I was really much inspired in writing that book. That's why I call it also a political book, in what Hans Morgenthau once famously said to Hannah Arendt, which is, I quote, and I have it in the book, we are intellectual street fighters, and if we do not make clear on which side of the barricades we stand, we have failed. That has always resonated with me as a scholar, as a theorist, and it does even more so today. And for me, actually, in writing the book, Kelsen is part of taking a stand in today's struggles. And by today's struggles, I mean the struggle at a very general level between those who want to see more law and against those who are happy with power politics as we see it. The law versus power debate, which is my starting point, is not new, but it tends to be very, very ideologized as we progress. And usually that debate, law versus power, is usually framed as a debate between realists and idealists, political realism versus political idealism. And the realists, and again, I still claim to this day to be a liberal realist, a progressive realist, but a realist nonetheless. And what realists usually do is they claim 2 things. They claim analytical rigor, to really know what's going on in the world, and they claim moral courage, to look power politics in the eye and in some ways act accordingly with all the moral dilemmas that this brings. And by the same token, most of these realists accuse the other side, these idealists, political idealists, as being totally naive when it comes to things like human nature, politics, society, and how international relations work. I've always been unhappy with this binary constellation between realism and idealism, and my move in that book is, through Kelsen, try to turn the debate on its head in a very provocative or contrarian way. And the key claim in the book is that insisting on law and insisting on international law as a means to tame power politics is not naive, but may actually be the real realism. Now I want to explain this at some greater depth. The realism versus idealism divide is not new, it's quite old. The whole of the history of political thought can sort of be classified in that way, even though we do all know this is not really picture perfect way in dividing up political theory. There are two instrumental figures when we talk about realism and idealism. This is the starting point of my book. And this is Hans Morgenthau and John Hertz, both of whom, as we all know, were students of Hans Kelsen in the 1930s. But what both are saying is what realists and idealists really separate from one another is the concept of human nature, or the conception of human nature, what these two groups sort of share within them. As Morgenthau says very famously in Politics Among Nations, which is a key text during the Cold War, he says, idealists believe, quote, in the goodness of human nature. John Hertz has agreed with that and says, idealists say, quote, that man is basically good. E.H. Carr, a British realist, a former diplomat and historian, takes this then to another level, and together with Morgenthau and John Hertz, who should have known better because they studied with Kelsen in the 1930s, then reinforce this kind of cliche that has been reinforced through the decades, and that is, in the words of E.H. Carr, peace through law is just, quote, another distinguished international lawyer's dream. And by that he means, of course, Hans Kelsen. I say these three gentlemen, they got it all wrong. Okay, they get it wrong, and I want to explain why that is and why Kelsen, at least how I see it, was anything but a dreamer. So before we talk about war and peace, let's talk a little bit about the key concept in this debate, and that is the concept, of course, of human nature. What I tend to do in classes, what I will not do today, is to play this little game and hand out selective quotes about human nature, and then ask my students whether they think this is something that perhaps Morgenthau or Reinhold Niebuhr or John Hertz has said, or maybe that's something that even Kant may have said, or John Rawls, or actually Hans Kelsen. I'm not going to do this. I want to bring in 4 quotes, and they're all by Kelsen. Okay, so no riddles here. It's all said and written by Kelsen. And I do this in one chapter in particular to show that Kelsen, from first to last, saw, as I put it here on the slide, saw no angels. Okay, we are not that good, at least according to him. He says something like, quote, the big fish swallow the small ones in the life of the animals as in the life of humans, which echoes, of course, a brutal kind of Darwinism. At some point, he speaks of, quote, the innate urge to aggression in man, which echoes Freud's theory of drives. More politically, he speaks about the fact that, quote, the withering away of the state is an illusion, which basically translates into this Kelsenian war cry that law and coercion are permanent for society, whether we like it or not. We cannot live without it. And the fourth one is, echoing Freud, again, is to count on a human nature different from that known to us is utopia. And what Kelsen meant by from that known to us is, at least according to my reading, known to us, handed down to us back then by Sigmund Freud, which at the time was, of course, the most provocative, but also the most widely read theory of human nature. And I made this claim in the book because I did my PhD on the question, how much Freudian influence is there actually among classical political realists? But I make the claim in the book that Kelsen did not only read Freud, as they all did back then. He really studied it. Okay, he attended Freud's famous Wednesday meetings in the Berggasse in the 9th district. He wrote texts on Freud. Okay, he wrote this paper on the conception of the state from the point of view of social psychology, which he meant, of course, Freud's social psychology. So he really studied it. He moves in the circles of psychoanalysis at the time. He knows Freud, of course, personally. I think anecdotally at one point they go on vacation together. So what I see here is what I call a Freudian human nature realism in Kelsen. And compared to what I did during my PhD, I even go further and say oftentimes Kelsen wasn't only not naive, but oftentimes he appears more realist than actually the realists themselves. And that is a point I go back to when we talk about peace through law. For me, that has meant actually that once, and this is the claim I want to make, once you start reading or rereading Kelsen from this kind of Freudian human nature realist angle, then maybe not a new Kelsen emerges on the scene, but maybe one that is at least a bit different from the one that we know through the biased eyes and ears of the realists in saying that Kelsen was a naive idealist. What I would like to do now, very, very briefly actually, talk about Kelsen's foreign policy realism, really pinpointed down to the question of war in Kelsen. Kelsen did not what we would have qualified today as a theory of war. He did not do this. But you can reconstruct in Kelsen, this is what I did in chapter 4, a kind of why war thinking according to Kelsen. And what I found is that Kelsen's thinking on why war operates on 3 levels, 3 ingredients, 3 elements. But I like the term 3 levels of analysis, because this is exactly the word that Kenneth Waltz would say later as an international relations scholar. On the first level, it's the human nature level, it's brain, human nature, power. When Kelsen says there's a will to power within the individual, which leads to egoism, the drive to domination. Morgenthau called it the animus dominandi, the lust for power. Kelsen is pretty similar, but possibly because they took it. Morgenthau, there's this debate from Nietzsche first. Kelsen, I'm relatively sure it's from Freud. But one ingredient why war is human nature in some ways, but not directly, but indirectly, because the argument is what every realist has been doing, Freud has been saying, and Kelsen, at least to me, is okay. What happens is living together in a polity within the state means instinctual repression. Okay? Otherwise, we could not live together relatively peacefully within a polity, whether it be a state or a tribe or whatever, or a nation. But what happens is, and it's the downside of it, and by the way, you have the same argument in Reinhold Niebuhr, is we project all the more uglier instincts, the more uglier drives and the biases onto the international scene. And that's the second level of analysis. Power politics. We create a Westphalian state system where there are powers, large, some are larger, some are smaller, but they engage, of course, in rivalries, in brute power politics, in the game of balances of power, imbalances of power, and they clash. They clash oftentimes. Nationalism plays a huge role. And what Kelsen is saying, this brings us to the third level of analysis of why war. This power politics can happen because there's a permissive ingredient to all that. And that's the third ingredient on the international level. And that is, of course, international anarchy, meaning the absence of a higher coercive power above states that could coerce these states to be relatively peaceful. Basically, there is no world Leviathan around us. So Kelsen is pretty much saying war erupts, and war is an ever-present possibility when these three elements combine, and power politics unfolds unchecked because there is international anarchy. Crucially, my point is pretty much every realist on this planet, historically, and even now the neo-realists, would agree with that logic. Okay? Kelsen, to me, is no outlier in this kind of intellectual or theoretical setup. What is, of course, interesting is, and even in that sense, realists are agreed with Kelsen or vice versa. If you happen to think that human nature is relatively fixed, relatively, not entirely not fixed, relatively fixed, of course, there's room for moral learning, for becoming better. Developmental psychology, even Freud said, we have the capacity for reason. But on the assumption that human nature is relatively fixed, meaning we have these polities that engage in these power struggles, then anarchy, international anarchy, is the permissive condition that allows that we play this power political game, which then, of course, means if human nature is relatively fixed, we have to get rid of anarchy as best as possible. Which brings me to the question of peace, actually. And Kelsen's punchline really is, if war is a function of human nature plus power politics based on the condition of international anarchy, then actually only law can take it. And I use this kind of Clinton-esque paraphrasal of it's not the economy stupid, but according to García, it's the law stupid. But not only that, I really want to make the claim in the book that Kelsen says this, not because he's perhaps a nice Kantian, or he's a nice old world gentleman, as Bernhard Schlink once put it, but there's a realist undercurrent why he makes the case for law. And I would like to go through a few options that have been brought forward intellectually, theoretically, but also in the practical political context. And as I see it, we tend to have four ideal type visions of what makes peace. One is the good old-fashioned Kantian democratic peace theory. Basically saying if all nations, all states on this planet were democracies, then there would be no war. Okay. Every realist says, okay, or most of the realists at least would argue, democracy is better than autocracy, but to believe that democracies do not fight wars is naive. Okay? Because if anarchy is the problem, then it doesn't really matter whether you have a democracy or an autocracy. And in fact, Kelsen agrees with that. Kelsen is a diehard, one of the most passionate democratic theorists we have, I think, in the history of political thought. And he would make the case, of course, let's have more democracies than autocracies. But when it comes to the question, peace through what? Peace through democratic peace theory, then he would say, no, this is insufficient. It may help to some degree to get to a more pacified world. But that's pretty much it. The second way, the second kind of thinking, how do we get to a normatively, to a more peaceful world is, of course, peace through commerce, peace through globalization. The idea being, okay, if we did more trade with one another, the costs of waging war with one another would be so high that no nation would be so stupid to engage in war, because it would be too costly. Again, every realist on this planet agrees that commerce does not pass by itself, does not pacify international relations. And again, Kelsen is agreed. Kelsen also says in Peaceful Law, a nice little book written in 1944, political interests and politics always trumps economic reasons. Okay? It's always more powerful. Okay. Number three, third idea, practically, intellectually, theoretically, peace through a balance of power. This is where realists and Kelsen in some ways part company, because realists pretty much of all stripes would argue, since democratic peace theory is insufficient, since globalization commerce is insufficient, and since law is insufficient, according to the realists, we have to be content with the idea, let's create a balance of power among the major powers, and that means they would not be stupid enough to fight one another because the risk of losing a war would be too great, it would be suicidal. Of course, put to the extreme during the Cold War, this leads to this notion of mutually assured destruction. Okay, back then, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union, they knew neither side can win this. Of course, what happened is many satellite wars somewhere else. They did not fight each other directly, but they used their satellites and they waged their wars in different regions. And this is where Kelsen comes in. And I think Kelsen makes a very smart move, again, as I read him. And he tries to beat the realists in their own game and sort of makes the argument, quite rightly, I'm agreed with that argument, actually, is if you really believe in human nature realism and all these things that it brings with it, okay, biases, the will to power, egoism, the lust for domination, nationalism writ large, how on earth could you trust a wise statesman or wise stateswoman to do each and every day exactly the right thing, to manipulate the balance of power to a degree that each side knows that war does not pay? And then secondly, even if there was that person around, this wise statesman or wise stateswoman, act accordingly in a political context, in a domestic political context and in an international political context. And I think what Kelsen does is really, really smart, because he tries to beat the realists in their own game and says, look, if you're serious about human nature, why do you have this trust, this trust in the wise, in this ideal of a wise statesman? And then, of course, according to Kelsen, we are left with sort of with the fourth option, and that would be peace through law. But not so much, at least as I read it, in terms of a normative vision of us being all that good and nice Kantians, and we want to live in a peaceful world, and we want to abide by law and all these nice little values that comes with it, but simply because all the other options fail, and they fail badly. And so, from a very technical view, perhaps law to Kelsen in that sense is simply the organization of power politics at a higher level. And just as domestic law organizes domestic power struggles within the states, the idea is international law with teeth, with a coercive element to it attached to it, can organize power relations among states. And I guess the punchline here in Kelsen is peace comes through law, or it doesn't come at all. On that note, let me conclude The core message in the book, as I see it, Kelsen is not a dreamer. He is not an utopian thinker. He never was, but he may be one of the most deepest realists who are out there. Point one. Point two, the relevance of Kelsenian thinking, him as a person, of course, but also the kind of thinking, political thinking that comes with him is as relevant today as it has ever been. Perhaps even more so in 2025 than in 2018 when I wrote the book, which is without law, democracy collapses, and without international law persists, and war remains an ever-present possibility. I really do believe that Kelsen speaks directly to our world of crisis, great power politics, great power realism, a world of war, hybrid warfare, and of course democratic backsliding. And I take it also, and it's the politics in Kelsen in my book, with which I started my talk, and that is Kelsen's reminder, forceful reminder, I guess, that we must work unceasingly towards eliminate international anarchy through a centralized, coercive legal order, because if we do not do that, democracy at risk and the international order is at grave risk. And on that note, I thank you very much for your time and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Schuett. Right now, we give the floor to Professor José García Sáenz from the University of Valencia. Thank you very much, Professor García. The floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it's a pleasure to be again in El Externado, even virtually, and even if it's late here in the night. But well, don't worry that I have my favorite cup of coffee with me from Colombia, so it feels almost like being there with you. And I wish, of course, to thank to my colleague, Professor Diego Moreno, and to Professor Jorge Restrepo and the Center for this opportunity. This is the second time in a short period that I am together with Alexander Springer to discuss about Kelsen. And it's also the second time that I have met with Robert Schuett to discuss his wonderful book. So I take this seminar like a continuation of an ongoing dialogue. After both seminars with Alexander and Robert, I exchanged friendly mails with them about details, and I believe that it demonstrates the accuracy of their intellectual commitment. And that is why I feel so fortunate to share this event with them, and also given my admiration for Austria and its best ambassador, who is, of course, Hans Kelsen. No? Well, in these 30 minutes, I will try to offer some general reflections on Robert's book and to make some remarks specifically around the topic of war and peace. And of course, as we are street fighters, there will be many disagreements, but also many agreements. Well, to explain my strong interest in the book of Robert, and for sure it's a great news, the translation into Spanish. Let me just give a bit context about myself. The topic of my doctoral dissertation, defended in 2014, was the contrast between what I call the legal pacifism of Hans Kelsen and the political realism of Hans Morgenthau. And well, I published that book in 2016 that Alexander said, Kelsen versus Morgenthau, unfortunately only in Spanish. So has not been widely distributed, I'm afraid. Well, in the course of this work, I became aware that what at the beginning appeared to be an absolute opposition, I mean, the legal pacifism of Kelsen versus the political realism of Morgenthau was not so opposite, and the positions were nuanced as the works and lives of Kelsen and Morgenthau were crossing between them over and over again. And yes, we can say that Kelsen is not necessarily on the side of the utopia, and neither Morgenthau is always on the side of apology, to use the famous Koskeniemi's categories. No? It was therefore a pleasant surprise for me to find that Roberts tries also to reveal in some way that hidden dialogue between Kelsen and Morgenthau. And I think I'm not wrong if I say that Morgenthau is the most quoted author in the book after Kelsen. So for me, reading and rereading this book has been very useful to think again some ideas of my own work. No? Well, going into Robert's book, I want to say that I love his style, his method, his direct style, crystal clear, pedagogical, emotional. I will say a bit of Kelsenolatric, but well, it's a shared philia, so it hasn't bothered me. His method relies heavily on biography, and when it comes to Kelsen, I think this is always a hit, because Kelsen's life always has something to teach us. I have enjoyed a lot of learning some new details for me, details that, however, are not pure fun, but serve to support the image of a man who certainly did not live in an academic ivory tower, but rather, as Robert points out, always had one foot in theory and other foot in practice. People usually think in Kelsen like a theorist, and only a theorist, a pure theorist, and it's fair enough to highlight that he was also a practitioner of law. And I will say that I find two big shared ideas or agreements in Robert's book. The first one is that it's fair enough to defend Kelsen against those accusations of being idealist or naive. This will be our big agreement. The second agreement will be that it's fully necessary to bring Kelsen back once again. That is necessary to spread the Kelsenian thought about international law and to apply it to the field of international relations. Just as Posner and Goldsmith famously tried to show the limits of international law, Kelsen is useful to show the limits of international relations. Limits that have to do with the world peace, yes, but also with the effectiveness of human rights for all, with combat climate crisis, and so on. The internationalist Kelsen has still many things to say about the world of today. Not of yesterday, but about the world of today. I think this is important. And say this, I think that our first agreement contains a big or a disagreement, which is the next. I don't think that for defending Kelsen, as Robert does, from being idealist, will be necessary to transform Kelsen into a political realist. For me, the label political realist could be wild, could be elastic, but it's not so elastic in my opinion, and I will try to explain why you didn't quite convince me, Robert, on that particular point. Of course, in Kelsen's methodological toolbox, there is a political analysis that is strongly rooted in reality. And yes, his conception of human nature is influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis, by liberal thinkers, and even for the classics. But I think that using realist ideas, especially the anthropological pessimism, does not necessarily imply being a realist, or does not make the label political realist descriptive of Kelsen thought, in my opinion. It is difficult for me to agree with that, at least if we take the conventional concept of political realism. Let me put it this way. I love go swimming. I swim twice a week, but that doesn't make me a swimmer. The label swimmer will not be accurate to identify me because just because I usually go to swimming. Well, I think the same happens with Kelsen and with the centrality that you attribute to political realism within his thought. Kelsen is above all a legal thinker for me, not a political thinker. But of course, law does not come from nowhere. Law comes from power. And of course, Kelsen is well aware of that fact, the Gorgon head that you say before. That is why one cannot understand, for instance, the group norm without understanding the principle of effectiveness as the main norm of customary international law, for instance. And my reluctance to describe Kelsen as a political realist is even being aware that, of course, other readings of political realism are possible, particularly progressive readings like those made by Scheuermann or Williams, which you, Robert, collect in your book. And yes, we can and we should, I think, make a more complex and careful reinterpretation of classical realists like Morgenthau, Herth, or Carr. I'm thinking now that I did the same with Morgenthau. Maybe I published that book 2 years ago, naming Morgenthau as a pacifist. So would be kind of reverse of your book, even in a much less provocative fashion, but could be kind of reverse, no, in Morgenthau. But even so, again, I still find extremely problematic to put Hans Kelsen under the same level of those political realist thinkers for many reasons, but I will only mention 3 main reasons. The first one is the principle of reality, from which the first one, the principle of reality. Where is the principle of reality from which Kelsen would elaborate his political thought? This principle of reality is a central element in political realism because political realists build their normative prescriptions from it. Alessandro Passerin d'Entreves said that realism is a radical form of empiricism. And I think that important element is not in Kelsen. Of course, Kelsen, again, is well aware of the political reality of his time and takes it well into account to formulate his proposals of legislative policy. But precisely because the law has a social function, that of guiding human behavior in society, the content of norms must always be of possible compliance. And Kelsen knew that much more before than Herbert Hart and his famous minimal content of natural law. And when it comes to norms of international society, such norms must be able to be fulfilled by the actors of international reality. That is something undeniable, and it's always present in Kelsen's internationalist thought. For instance, in the proposal of the centrality of an international permanent court with the capacity to process individuals. This is a feasible step for him. There are strategical reasons and not just legal reasons. But to say that is not to say that Kelsen dedicates himself to analyzing political reality, as in my view, political realists do. It's hard for me to think a political realist without that empirical analysis of the reality, that it's also usually a prescriptive analysis. The second reason has to do with the role of history. As far as I know, realists, almost all of them, take the historical constants, the learning from history, as absolutely fundamental. But again, this is something that Kelsen does not. In fact, and I'm sorry for saying that, but I think that Kelsen was a pretty bad historian. Well, nobody is perfect. Kelsen used the history in some passages, and I could give 2 or 3 recurring examples in him, but I will say that he does so only in a rhetorical way. The third reason has to do with the relationship between law and politics. I will argue that being a political realist, even a progressive one, involves relativizing the normative force of law. According to political realists, law will serve only to regulate some issues of the reality, usually minor issues, but not every issue, especially centrally political issues like those related with sovereignty. From his first works, for instance, Morgenthau focused on criticizing the real possibility of an international jurisdiction. And as we know, that's exactly the opposite of Kelsen's position. For Kelsen, everything, even the big political problems, could be solved through legal means, through legal procedures. And in my knowledge, that is something that any political realist believes. For Kelsen, law is the main tool in constructing a world peace through law, and any political realist will accept that, I think. And well, say that, let's leave behind the disagreement and let's turn to the substantive agreement, which is Kelsen is not a naive nor an idealist. And here I would like to reinforce the main argument of Robert with some ideas that we find in Kelsen's works on international law that I think are not in the book. So my proposal here will be only to complete the argument. Also because there are 3 works fundamental to talk about war and peace in Kelsen. The first one will be Das Problem der Souveränität 1920. In that important book, written while Kelsen was working at the War Ministry in Vienna, he makes an in-depth analysis of the different theories of the relationship between international law and state law. In it, he rejects a dualist or pluralist position, but he maintains that the theory of state monism that give primacy to state law cannot be rejected on the basis of a logical or scientific reason. That is, the choice is between an international monism or an state monism. And this choice is a political one. It is perhaps here, 1920, the first writing of Kelsen in which we see so clearly the need to make political choices. Yes, Kelsen prefers internationalist monism, which he considers to be the position that favors world peace, but he does not want to cheat anyone. It's about a political option and also an ethical one, by the way. It's important, right? Second work, Legal Technique in International Law, 1939. This is the book that Kelsen writes during his exile in Geneva, and in which he makes an accurate critical analysis of the Covenant of the League of Nations. It is curious that he undertakes this legal technical review of the Covenant in 1939, when the League was agonizing. What remained from the League of Nations in 1939? Kelsen is aware of this fact and protects himself against accusation of being naive. I quote, "It is not the technical defects of the Covenant that will do away with the League, but the lack of political will." It's also crystal clear. He's also aware that the detailed technical analysis that he make of the convention will produce little or none effect among the political leaders. But he does not give up his efforts because he considers that it can at least serve, and I quote again, as a contribution to the legal technique of the future. This is not naive, but it's hard not to find some kind of idealism, and I say so in a non-pejorative way at all, but in the sense of believing in ideals, believing in the ideal of peace, of course. And the third main work will be the Law of the United Nations, 1950, already in America, probably feeling bad about not being able to participate in the preparatory works for the San Francisco Charter. Kelsen undertakes an analysis of the Charter like the one he did of the League of Nations Covenant 11 years earlier, but this time in a much more detailed way. In my opinion, this is the book in which we can observe Kelsen's theory of interpretation more clearly. The lawyer task is not to make decisions, but to show the politician, the decision maker, all the interpretative options that a norm allows, even those options that are not wanted by the legal advisor. He begins his book by saying, and I quote again, "This book is a juristic, not a political approach to the problem of the United Nations." But this is in no way prevents him from understanding the political dimension of the United Nations. And a little later in the book, he will establish, I quote, "The foregoing remarks concerning the separation of law from politics show that the former, law, as a means, is subordinate to the latter, the politics, as an end, and that political ends may be achieved by other means than by imposing obligations and conferring rights upon persons subjected to law. But just as it will be foolish to underestimate the political aspect, it will be a serious mistake to ignore the importance of the task of improving, as far as possible, the law established to serve the purposes of the United Nations. Unquote. So this is a fundamental affirmation. Kelsen recognized that law as means is subordinate to politics as an end, or would be better to say to political ends. Law is not the only means to reach those ends, but is a fundamental one, a means that needs to continue technical development, but also a political and ethical roadmap. And of course, there will be the articles about Nuremberg. We could add reports, brief, other articles, some of them published, some of them still in the archives. All that writings in which Kelsen have, no doubt, one leg in theory, one leg in practice, and that are not at all naive works. Well, I wish not to finish without mention the elephant in the room, who is Gaza, Palestine, where thousands of people, children included, are starving right now when we spend the time speculating about peace and war. What Kelsen will say, if so? Well, as the archives never stop from feeding us, recently we have known from Samuel Moyn about a letter that in 1966, his nephew, the also internationalist lawyer John Fried, wrote to Kelsen. You have to read, all of you have to read this letter. It's very emotional. His nephew implored Kelsen to make a statement on Vietnam War, on the war crimes committed by the United States in Vietnam. And Kelsen never did so. Kelsen remained silent as far as we know. And we could say that his work speaks for him and will be true, but still, I think is disappointing. Even more disappointing if we compare him with the other political realist, Hans Morgenthau, which took a very public role in the intellectual opposition to Vietnam. And this is because Kelsen will be a coward? Of course not. Was he a supporter of the new power? Of course not, not senses. In my opinion, it's because Kelsen, I think, was not a political thinker, was a legal thinker. He analyzes legal norms and not political facts. And that approach has his limitation. This is something I know we need to keep talking about, and that's why I stop myself here. Thank you for your attention and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Garcia, for your very sharp comments on the book. I think that before we give the floor to anybody else or proceed to any discussion, I think we have to respect the sacred right to reply to critics. So, if you may.
I will do so. And again, thank you. Jose, thank you very much for your, as ever, very thoughtful and astute comments. I feel for you in terms of time, by the way. I'm still jet lagged, so I'm quite tired as well. So I may not be as sharp as I usually am, but please forgive me. But again, thank you very much. Where do I begin? I mean, as you know, of course, some of you know in the room know, I tend to say that Hans Kelsen is my most favorite political philosopher. I come back to that point why I emphasize this, political. I do not want to steal him away from jurists. It's just the fact I'm not a jurist, so I feel incompetent to talk about his legal theory and simply make the case or to want to talk about his politics. So he's my most favorite political philosopher for many, many reasons. One is the realism bit, but there's also many others. His passion for democracy, his passion for science, his passion for speaking truth to power, which is also, by the way, something that Hans Morgenthau, of course, was much better at, actually. And by the way, thank you for pointing out this letter, 1966. I will look it up and I will be very happy to read. My point is Hans Morgenthau is my second most favorite philosopher. And there's a reason why I say that. I am completely agreed with you that there are other ways in defending Hans Kelsen from being a Kantian-style naive idealist or so, where there is agreement between us, Jose, that he was not. You basically say, if I understand you correctly, and I remember our first conversation 3 years ago, you basically say, I take it too far, right? And actually, yeah, perhaps I really do. Perhaps I do take it too far in making him a political realist. And that's why I said in the very beginning not to be modest. But when you, Alexander, presented me as a Hans Kelsen scholar, and I said, look, I'm not really sure that I'm a Hans Kelsen scholar. I'm an international relations theorist. I'm interested in political realism, much more so than perhaps in Hans Kelsen, even though I love that man. What I'm trying to say is, I come, and you touched upon it, Jose, I come from an intellectual background from a time in the UK when I did my MA and my PhD in the noughties, if you wish, more of an English school background. Okay, I'm inspired by people by Chris Brown, Richard Little, Tony Lang, who did all of them, who also worked on Hans Morgenthau, because as you know, from a very particular angle. William Scheuermann, of course, is someone from whom I've taken a lot. And I bring all these people in. And by the way, Jose, William Scheuermann and Tony Lang were 2 out of the 3 external referees for my habilitation thesis. So you see the influence. So maybe the book is more actually about what is realism, or what may be realism. What can political realism be intellectually and practically? Then it's about everything there is to say about Hans Kelsen, okay, of which I only have partial knowledge. So I believe I do take it too far. At the moment, I'm working on a solution, or try to work on a solution, which I will talk about in a minute. But what really drove my book on Kelsen's political realism is that I was totally unhappy with present-day political realism, with the political realism of people like John Mearsheimer, and with the political realism of people like Kenneth Waltz, these so-called neo-realists. So I come out from an English school kind of driven perspective and say that classical political realists were that's why I brought up Kelsen and Morgenthau, that these people, these realists, these earlier realists may have been much, much closer with Hans Kelsen than today's realists. And I find it's very important to emphasize, because that would also politically, practically mean that there's a room for a conversation about in what kind of world we want to live in. Because actually, when you look at today's political realists, again, I hate to bring him up again, but people like John Mearsheimer, they take basically the world as it is. They do not talk about a better world or what we can do about these power struggles. They've got nothing to say about this. But as you, Jose, know, of course, perhaps even much better than I do, people like Hans Morgenthau, they thought a lot about how do we get out of this mess alive. And even Morgenthau, of course, was toying with the idea at some point of a world state. Because he knew basically, okay, we have to tame international anarchy. The fact that people like Morgenthau and Hans Morgenthau then said, okay, it may be very unlikely and it's not very desirable to get to a point where there is a kind of centralized world state, is actually then again, but very similar to what Hans Kelsen was arguing, because even Hans Kelsen did not want to see a world state. He was arguing for a world federal state, which is something slightly different. So actually my point is, yes, I take it too far, but I did it. Again, maybe not to make the argument there's a new Kelsen. I try to make the argument that some of the stuff that Kelsen has said has a realist undertone to it. Maybe that would be a phrasing that Jose, you would be happy with. But I really wanted to provoke present-day realists actually with that book and bring in Hans Kelsen and say, look, that guy who gets mocked and ridiculed by realists may have been much, much closer to what the classical realists were arguing about. By the way, another comment shortly, I happened to had a chance many years ago in the Library of Congress to read the letter exchange between Morgenthau and Henry Kissinger on Vietnam. It's brutal. It's beautiful and brutal at one and the same time. How Kelsen makes the moral, how Morgenthau makes the analytical and the moral case why Vietnam is wrong. And even though I'm not here to defend Kelsen on this 1966 letter that you have mentioned, Jose, but I guess from what we know, I think once Kelsen had to flee Europe and settled in the United States, and of course purely biographically, he was quite struggling to make a new life in the United States, also financially. I think he especially once he set foot in the United States, he stayed clear of, or he tried to stay clear of as many political debates as possible. And I think actually, given his life experience in Europe and how fascism and Nazism sort of threatened his life many times over, I can, at least on a personal level, understand that at the age, it was 1966, by that time he was in his late 80s, must have been his late 80s, that he may have said, look, this is nothing for me to comment. There are younger ones, people like Hans Morgenthau out there who do a much better job. Again, I'm not here to defend Kelsen, but maybe that explains. It's not a lack of caring or understanding, because I guess all of us in the room, it's very likely that Hans Kelsen was not very happy with Vietnam, of course, even though he did not speak out against it publicly. The other 3 points you have mentioned about the reality, about history, law versus politics, you said in the beginning you share you share some of the stuff in writing, and I will be very happy to respond in writing, Jose, okay, at a later time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we have quite some food for thought regarding those things on which you two disagree. But I think I like to present a couple of brain teasers regarding those things you actually agree on. Because I think somehow what Professor García points out is that you make a very compelling case for Kelsen being a realist in some respects, or at least having some points of intersection with what could be political thought, a political realistic thought. Fair enough. However, the two of you have discarded a couple of things that would be the common counter claims against this form of realisms. And I think we can present them in forms of three charges. The first charge, which is perhaps the one the two of you stand against the most, especially because of all the sympathy you show towards Hans Kelsen, is that of naivety, because naivety seems to be also like a problem of character even, right? I think you do indeed make a compelling case for seeing that Kelsen was quite aware of a realistic possibility of peace, because he says the main problem here we have is anarchy, international anarchy. International anarchy could be overcome given these presuppositions. We could come to certain agreements. We cannot expect simply that out of good nature, we cannot expect simply that out of capitalism or socialism, we're gonna find an agreement in peace. However, it didn't happen. And let's not take the advantage of hindsight being always 2020. Let's stand in 1944. What happens in 1944? We are at the beginning of the most aggressive arms race we've ever seen. We also have a huge problem in the world, which is that half of the world, precisely most of those parts of the world that are not being seen by European thinkers, are demanding Westphalian sovereignty through means of decolonization. And demanding Westphalian sovereignty is pretty much demanding that anarchy and seeing any form of international interference precisely as keeping those empires alive. And we can say that actually that brought more war. I mean, the end of, let's say, Pax Britannica brought more war in several parts of the world. And let's say that Kelsen didn't pay that much attention to that. Doesn't that imply some form of naivety? Just a question, just a brain teaser. The second claim would be democratic over enthusiasm. I think you are correct. Kelsen is not a naive Kantian. He doesn't think that there's a rational necessity that's going to lead from democracy, from country to an eventual form of international system of peace. That is clear. However, when Kelsen thinks that democracy is less prone to war, it's not just because of what you call in the book patterns of internal policy. It could also be because Kelsen thinks there's a link between ethical skepticism, ethical non-cognitivism, and democracy. When we know that we don't have a fixed pattern to answer practical questions, it seems that the most reasonable thing is to ask everybody what they want. And once we ask everybody what they want, we can come to better decisions. By necessity, such a claim, I think, implies a decrease in belligerency. Because we're going to ask people. We're not going to be completely convinced to just go and annihilate them. So, again, as a question, isn't he a bit of an idealist when it comes to democracy and peace? Perhaps not in strict Kantian terms, but to a great extent because of his theory of democracy as a way of somehow pacifying practical questions. And the third charge, is regarding something you mentioned somehow bypassing in chapter 4 in your book, which is that you deny that Kelsen is an activist or a militant. Somehow, as if being an activist or a militant is attached to being an idealist in political relations. I'm not sure of that. And I'm not sure of either of the two claims. First of all, was he not an activist? I think the very enterprise of peace through law is activism. Even in his own terms, as a pure jurist, the idea of peace through law is impure. Because we're going to take international law as it is, but we're going to interpret it in such a way that it leads us to law. Sometimes even stretching interpretations to come to agreements that were useful in 1945. Also, the very idea of saying law has some goal, which is international peace. The pure theorist says law has no goal. Law can have any goal. Genocide can be a legal goal.
Yep.
You know? So here he says, no, let's take law and use it. That is activism. But the question is that not realistic? Is that not a realist stand? Because actually, in order for me to be an efficacious realist, what do I need? Well, I have to be a realist. I cannot make random claims, random invitations to pure morality or to expectations of reasonable beings or so on, without being a realist to some extent when I'm going to be an activist. So with these three charges, I think both you and Professor García can perhaps discuss some of those things in which you agree and that perhaps could be wrong. So the floor is yours if you wish to address these things.
Okay. Thank you. Jose, would you like me to start, or would you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So then, but please chip in or jump in at any time you want, of course. Wow. Naivety. The first point, if I understand it correctly, did Kelsen back at the time really see what's going on in international society, right? Decolonization in particular. There is this famous, beautiful quote, which I think I bring very early on in the book, and I said before, by Bernhard Schlink in the New York Times, 1999, because he speaks of Kelsen as an old world gentleman. By which Schlink meant more like in terms of his style and his character, not so much his political figure. But actually, the term old world gentleman maybe is part and parcel to what you're suggesting. Kelsen, given his life and times, the way he grew up, his formative years being Vienna, at the time, Viennese modernism, very Eurocentric. Of course, let's no doubt about it. Very, very much Eurocentric in some ways. Perhaps he was, in that regard, from the old world and did not pay attention to these political dynamics elsewhere, what we would now call the global south. I think that's surely a fair claim that one could not outrightly reject, but I could not also say it's totally correct. But even if that was the case, what you are suggesting, and I'm with you actually. There's reasonates with me. I guess from this Kelsenian perspective, because I do not want to say what he would say, because it's very dangerous for a reason he's not alive. So, but what I would say, how I read him, he would perhaps make the argument, the way how he conceived peace through law, in the book Peace Through Law, written in 1944, it's pretty much democracy on a large scale. Is one country, it's not one man, one vote, backed by a legal coercive order, that makes all our lives pleasant, but it would be one nation, one vote, backed by a legal coercive order, which actually ends imperialism and the danger of renewed colonization. So even though he would never, of course, have used that kind of language, being an old veteran, I guess from a Kelsenian perspective, you could make the argument everyone's better off because it's relatively equal. One nation, one vote, backed by legal coercive order. And what? But please, that's more political comment that I'm making now, and which I'm happy to discuss. I mean, to any one of these countries, these newly decolonized ones, and of course there's much to be made that it's their right to self-determination. I mean, do they really believe, being afraid of a kind of legal international order that is run by the big powers, do they really believe they are better off by being out there in the international system by themselves against the great powers? I find that argument very, I find that naive to be honest, even though I can understand why small nations, small states want to have that and strive in their newly gained nationalism or newly gained independence, newly gained freedom, if you wish. But again, as a realist, I would say, without having the back of international coercive law, they lose out. They lose out because the balance of power does not work in their favor. It works against them. That may be to your first point. Jose, shall we go point by point? Would you like to chip in before we get to the second point?
Yeah. I will say, well, first, replying to you, Robert, yes, I said 3 years before that you have gone too far, but I also said, and I repeat here, that someone had to do it. I mean that you have pushed the limits of political realism, and that is very, very stimulant. What I find interesting is using the tools of political realism to respond to realist or rather the pseudo-realist, as you correctly name to them. No? I'm doing this now, for instance, in the field of human rights, of international human rights. There are people today, such as Posner, no, who argue that international human rights law is useless because states do not comply with it, and they are reducing the B to the O to B, and well, I think that shift that we should do, taking those empirical tools, for instance, today, for me, wonderful books like those of Simon Beth, Mobilizing for Human Rights, Evidence for Hope of Catherine Sinkin, that they are international thinkers from the international relations that are giving facts, for instance, to say that human rights law is effective. And I think this shift is important in that. But well, I live here. I live here. Well, second question.
Okay. The second point, thank you, Jose, is you called it, is there a democratic over-enthusiasm? Is that right?
Yeah.
In Kelsen and perhaps in me and also Jose, I do not know. I would say briefly, yes and no. I think both. Yes, I think as I read Kelsen, on the one hand, actually on one point, I think I even call him an open society prophet. a relentless believer in the power of democracy, in the values of democracy, in its nature, in its ability, to create a relatively just society. There's this, but so yes, I am. Kelsen, Alexander can also say whether you are a true believer in the democracy. Yes, we are in an almost normative way. Yes. On the other hand, at least as how I read him, his theory of democracy has again a very realistic undertone to it. Not so much a normative, a realistic undercurrent or undertone. And that is when Kelsen basically says the need for a democracy does not necessarily arise from the fact that we are all good loving, good nurtured people and human beings, but it's basically a need to end based on this arch realistic methodological individualism and actually liberal individualism that to me Kelsen entertains with this Freudian human nature realism, that we have to come up with a governance system that gives each person in a polity exactly the same amount of saying what is going to happen in that society. So again, one man, one woman, one vote. Because if you, as Kelsen once put it, okay, if it is the case, as he believes, that we want, like Hans Morgenthau, the infamous animus dominandi, A wants to rule over B and B over C, we have to create a system where it may be possible that everybody rules over everyone at one and the same time in an equal fashion with an equal say in it. And that will be democracy. And if we don't do it, it will be the right of the stronger who always wins out. I say that, that's the kind of the no part to this answer. Yes, there is an over enthusiasm for democracy as a system, but there's also a very hard-nosed realist undertone to why it is almost a necessity to go for democracy, to kind of reduce, to keep the power struggles at bay and come up with a relatively fair system.
I agree. I basically agree. Nothing to say in this point.
Third point. The third point, activism. What I can say is, I'm not sure whether that's a satisfying answer, but maybe that's my way of provoking further thought and discussion. This is what Alexander and I was talking about, I think, last night in the car, along the car ride that we had. And it is this. I would not say, from today's point of view, he's an activist. He was not an activist. Of course, when you say, isn't the idea, okay, use the law to get to a state of peace, a sort of normative idea, an activist? In some ways, yes. But then, if that were true, then everyone in political theory with a normative political theory would qualify as an activist. I think that today's notion of activism, I would perhaps say Kelsen would be fairly, again, it's very dangerous to say because he's no longer with us, he's not alive, but perhaps he would be perhaps uncomfortable with this. Why? There's, of course, what Jose was saying. First and foremost, he was a legal theorist, he was a judge, trying to stay clear of too much involvement in political issues of the day, point one. But also there's something in Kelsen which I find remarkably interesting to pursue and to find out, which I have not really figured out yet. And that's this. Kelsen says at one point a democracy, this is what we discussed yesterday in the car, democracy is strong and has to be very strong because it has to allow voices that are not only weird or strange or awkward on the very left or on the very right of the political spectrum, but Kelsen really writes, puts down to paper and saying a democracy really has to be content with and allow voices that are actively opposed to democracy. So you have to allow the enemies of a democracy to voice their opinions. That is something a democracy has to grudgingly accept. And the state, with all its powers, has to step in only when these people resort to violence. So violence is the key issue for Kelsen. And I say this not to give you a clear-cut answer. I have to think much more about this, but maybe also to provoke some thoughts or some further points by you to say. It seems to me that in terms of freedom of speech, Kelsen had a remarkably wide tolerance. And if I take the word activism from today's point of view, which to me, I'm not against activism, not at all. But it seems to me what today's activists do, they tend to have a relatively narrow kind of tolerance here. And I think this goes totally against Kelsen's vision of a democracy. So that's why I would argue maybe it's not right. Yeah, Jose.
Yeah, well, on activism, some few remarks perhaps. I think maybe we can remember that Kelsen was never affiliated to any political party or never a society with political ends. For instance, it's illustrative maybe the correspondence with Umberto Campagnolo, to which Mario Lozano devoted three books. And Umberto Campagnolo was the only Italian student of Kelsen, and after the Second World War, he made the European Society of Culture. He invites his Dr. Vater, and Kelsen say no, not because his political aim of the European Society of Culture. I mean, he was maybe very close of that. Even his personal character, as Robert put it very well in the book, I think you say Kelsen was a networker. And yes, he was a networker. He was he has a lot of generosity with young scholars, even those that does not think like him, even with Smith in Köln, no? His tolerance. He was an activist of the tolerance, particularly in the academic field, and this is so many talks, so many things to talk here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to know if anybody here has a question.
Maybe only to thank you, all of you, for this amazing seminar. Thank you to Jose. Thank you, Professor Schuett. Thank you, Alexander. And thank you, our boss in the Legal Center of Philosophy of Law. And I am only a bridge between all of you for making this possible. Thank you for all of you. I only maybe have something to say that to Garcia. No, it's not a question to Jose. That you are that Kelsen should be seen as a legal thinker, no? Rather than a political thinker. But isn't it precisely the case that to be a legal thinker about political problems is already to occupy a space within political theory, at least in the academic sense? That seems to be Robert's point, I think. After all, the boundaries between law and politics may be institutionally be as something, a distinction in academic curricula or pensum of universities. But after all, the boundaries between law and politics may be, how Kelsen said, only through law is possible the peace. I think that maybe it is a theoretical politic that we can see, like Robert see Kelsen, a political theorist that have a very, very strong point of view that says peace is only possible through law. And maybe this is a very good opportunity for revise from academic point of view, pensum and curricula, the intertwined between legal theory and philosophy, political philosophy. Thanks for all of you for your points and your point of view. Thank you. And I now have to say.
So you have something to add?
Nothing in substance. I think Jose wants to go to, I'm sure Jose wants to go to sleep. And actually, I will go to sleep quite soon as well. Joking aside again. I guess what we were just saying, Professor, is I guess part of the book, and actually part of exactly this discussion here is exactly that. Also in academia, we treat law and political theory and moral philosophy and economics as very distant and very distinctive subjects. And I think an earlier generation of intellectual and academics, even though they were hellbent, and of course Kelsen was hellbent as well, to put the theory of law on a purely scientific footing, as we called it. And Morgenthau did the same thing for the study of politics and international relations. They tended to be closer to one another. They tended to cross-fertilize one another in terms of thinking. And I guess this is I guess very worthy and what we need even today as we did back then. And so on that note, thank you very much again for the invitation. Thank you much for moderating. Thank you much, Alexander and Jose. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Professor Schuett. Thank you very much, Professor Garcia, for not only for your participation, but also for your sacrifice for staying up this late. Thank you, Dr. Springer. Thank you, Professor Moreno, and everybody involved in this presentation. I'm going to briefly switch to Spanish now. Recordarle a todos los participantes en línea que ha sido traducido el libro del profesor Robert Schuett, El realismo político de Hans Kelsen, y ha sido publicado por la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, con el respaldo de la Sociedad Austriaca para las Ciencias Políticas, por la Embajada de Austria, y con una fundación, Zukunftsfonds de la República Austriaca. Recomendamos que lo compren. En mi caso, I'd like mine signed, please. Pero los demás de pronto no van a tener ese gusto, pero los invitamos a que adquieran el libro. Muchísimas gracias. Seguimos en contacto por todas las redes sociales del Centro de Investigación. Sí, claro. Para que tengan presentes las próximas actividades, tanto dentro de este ciclo de conferencias como de las demás actividades del Centro de Investigación. Profesor García.
Un gusto, muchas gracias y un abrazo, cuídense.
Bueno, muchas gracias a usted, gracias a todos los participantes, que tengan una buena tarde. Listo.
Thank you.
Hey, no, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.